May 9th, 1873, Labette County, Kansas. You arrive at a lonely cabin that faces the wind like a confession. The prairie stretches around you in a pale green hush. Grass sheds whispering. Fence wire humming. A sky of milk gray cloud pressed low over the earth. The door stands ajar. The hinges complain when you touch them. A thin, tired sound, as though the wood has learned to speak only in groans. Inside, the air is stale with dust and something metallic. A scent that clings to the back of the throat. A table sits squarely in the room, as if waiting for a prayer. Cutlery lies still. A bowl of dried peas has gone to pebbles. The canvas partition at the far end stirs, only when the wind remembers it. And beneath your boots the floorboards hold their sigh, one plank darker than the rest. One seam a little too carefully fitted, as if secrets require carpentry. You step closer. The light is poor and forgiving, but not forgiving enough. A fly lifts, circles, settles again. Your palm finds the dark seam and feels the telltale tremor of a hinge. The board lifts. Cold air rises like a story half told. The pit below is shallow, earthen, damp in its corners. What the light cannot name. Your body does salt, iron, time. You let the door fall shut with a soft thud that does not echo. Nothing in this house wants to echo. Outside, the orchard huddles in rows, trees bowed as if in prayer, the ground under them broken in small, careful rectangles of disturbed soil. The shovel marks are old enough to be polite, young enough to be legible. Grass tries to knit the wounds, but wind pulls the stitches open. You kneel and press your fingers into the dirt. It comes away darker than it should. The birds refuse to sing here. Even the prairie's constant wind lowers its voice to a breath. There was kindness offered at this table. Once bread, stew, a warm chair after the road. There were words about spirits and healing. A daughter with calm eyes who could read the world beyond. A family whose faces the neighbors could not quite remember without flinching. Travelers came hungry and left. This is the lie the cabin has been living with. You look again at the seam in the floor and understand the choreography. The chair placed just so. A voice to hold a gaze steady. A weight of silence before the fall. Murder shaped into hospitality until the two were indistinguishable. A wagon stands beyond the fence. Shafts empty, traces slack as abandoned veins. On the road, ruts sink toward the horizon. The prairie likes to keep what it takes: boot prints, wagon tracks, names. The wind carries only a single phrase back to the doorway, a sentence that is all question. Who was the last to sit here? Where did all the voices go? You return inside and let your hand rest on the tabletop. The wood is smooth from 100 small blessings. Elbows, plates, prayerful fingers. The casual drumming of a traveler telling a harmless story about a river too wide to ford, a winter too hungry to forget. Somewhere there is a ledger with a neat line of names that stopped before they ended. Somewhere there is a letter folded twice, addressed to a wife who waited one spring longer than she should have. Somewhere there is a brother who will not forgive the sky for being so broad when a body is so small. Before we continue, take a breath with me. Subscribe to Chronicles of Dread so you do not miss what comes next, and tell me what state you are listening from. The prairie is wide, but these stories find their way home. You close the trapdoor gently. The room accepts the gesture, but does not soften. On the table, A knife lies where it was last set down, its edge nicked, its steel clouded. The canvas at the back of the room stirs again. If you stand very still, you can almost hear the chairs scraping backward, a murmur of apology, the small benediction of a host's polite laugh. You can almost see the orchard in winter, the dirt too hard to receive anything, the trees holding their fruit in memory alone. The truth is not a thunderclap here. It is a low pressure that settles in the bones and refuses to lift. You look once more at the seam in the floor and understand why the wind lowers its voice when it crosses this threshold. Out on the road, neighbors are already gathering with shovels and lanterns. News travels on feet before it learns to use a horse. They will read the ground the way a minister reads a psalm. Slowly, with awe and fear, they will open the earth and find what the house has been teaching itself not to remember. And the nation, when it finally hears, will hold its breath and speak the family name with the caution of a prayer said backward. You step outside. The door will not close properly anymore. Some houses do not wish to be houses after certain kinds of nights. The wind lifts the orchard's leaves, and they answer in a single voice, the softest possible no. Out here, on this unending grass, a person can vanish by walking forward and never turning back. But the things we bury do not leave. They wait. The prairie keeps what is given to it, and the cabin will keep its silence. But the story will not let you go. Not now. Not after what you have seen. The prairie in the years after the Civil War was a land still in the act of becoming. Kansas, admitted to the Union in 1861, bore scars of conflict and promise in equal measure. The smoke of guerrilla raids and border wars had barely lifted before new settlers pressed westward, staking claims under the Homestead Act, turning open grass into fields, and building small communities along rivers and trails. The soil was rich, the air sharp with the scent of tall grass, and the sky stretched so wide it seemed almost merciless. For those who came to Kansas in the 1860s and 1870s, survival meant surrendering to both the generosity and cruelty of the land. The Osage Trail cut through this wilderness like an artery, once an ancient path for native peoples. By the 19th century, it carried wagons loaded with tools, seed, and hope. Traders and immigrants alike used it, the creak of wheels and the soft percussion of hooves echoing across an otherwise quiet plain. Stops along the trail became lifelines. A cabin offering a meal, a barn offering shelter for horses. These simple gestures could mean the difference between life and death for those facing exhaustion in an endless sea of grass. But every kindness relied on trust, and in a land where strangers passed more often than neighbors, that trust was fragile. The settlers of Labette County, where the Benders would later stake their claim, were a mix of the hopeful and the desperate. Many were European immigrants, drawn by promises of cheap land. Germans in particular had arrived in large numbers, bringing with them language, customs, and faith that often set them apart from their English-speaking neighbors. Communities were small. Families clung to one another, and churches doubled as gathering halls, courts, and sanctuaries. Sundays were filled with hymns, but weekdays were governed by sweat and soil. Life here was hard, and those who survived did so by trading labor and favors, binding the community in a fragile but necessary web. Yet beneath this sense of solidarity lay currents of suspicion. Frontier life sharpened the senses to danger. Wild animals prowled at the edges of farms. Outlaws roamed the trails, and native tribes displaced by settlement lingered in uneasy proximity. Disappearances were not uncommon. A man could ride out to trade and never return, his absence blamed on storms, theft, or violence. Death wore many disguises on the frontier, and people learned to accept loss as part of the bargain with the land. It was this atmosphere of uncertainty that made the ground so fertile for the Benders' deception. The Benders arrived quietly, sometime around 1871. Their origins were unclear even to their neighbors. Some said they had come from Germany directly, others that they had drifted in from another state. What was certain was that they erected a one-room cabin along the Osage Trail, a structure plain and unassuming. The front half functioned as a store and eating area, offering bread, dry goods, and hot meals. The back half was separated by a canvas sheet, where the family slept. For passing travelers, it was a beacon of civilization in an otherwise desolate stretch. For locals, it was simply another family scratching out a living in the soil. The family themselves were a study in contrast. John, sir, known as Pa, was tall and sullen, his English halting and thick with accent. His wife, Elvira, called Ma, carried an air of hostility, often scowling at neighbors and keeping to herself. Their son, John Jr., was awkward, prone to strange laughter that made others uneasy. But Kate, the daughter, was different, young, striking, and self-assured. She presented herself as a healer and medium, offering spiritual guidance in an era when seances and spirit rapping had captivated America's imagination. Kate was the family's public face, her charisma masking the coarser presence of her kin. To some, she was a curiosity. To others, a comfort in lonely times. By the early 1870s, the small community around Labette County had grown accustomed to hearing stories of travelers gone missing. A merchant never arrived at his destination. A prospector's wagon was found abandoned. A family heading west disappeared between one town and the next. Such tales carried weight but not certainty. Outlaws were common enough. So were accidents. Still, as the years passed, the pattern was undeniable. Too many travelers vanished near the same stretch of road, near the same lonely cabin. The people of Kansas read about progress and opportunity in their newspapers, new rail lines being laid, new towns incorporated, but they also read about violence. Crime flourished in the spaces where law was thin. Sheriffs covered vast territories with little support, and courts were often distant, delayed, or powerless. Vigilant committees filled the gap, delivering justice swiftly, sometimes cruelly. In such a climate, the Benders could operate with impunity, their cabin a mask of ordinary life, covering a pit of horrors. Daily life in Labette County gave no outward hint of the evil brewing within its borders. Farmers rose before dawn, yoked oxen to plows, and worked until dusk. Children fetched water, mended fences, and walked to one-room schools where a single teacher instructed every grade. Women tended gardens, baked bread, and stitched clothing until their hands ached. Evenings brought families together around oil lamps, the glow of the flame softening the fatigue etched on their faces. Hymns were sung, prayers recited, and neighbors occasionally gathered for barn raisings or communal harvests. Against this backdrop of routine, the Benders' crimes were all the more shocking. They thrived not in chaos, but in the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. When travelers arrived at the Bender homestead, they were stepping into what seemed to be another outpost of frontier hospitality. The smell of stew rising from the hearth, the promise of bread and rest, the soft words of Kate offering remedies or communion with departed loved ones, all of it felt reassuring. The cabin wore the costume of trust, and the Benders knew precisely how to play their parts. And so Kansas in the early 1870s stood at a crossroads, a place of hope and brutality, of civilization struggling against wilderness, of faith shadowed by fear. It was a land where a family could reinvent themselves with no questions asked, where disappearances could be shrugged off as accidents, and where the facade of hospitality could conceal the darkest intentions. By the time the truth came to light, the community would look back on these years and wonder how they had missed the signs. But in truth, nothing seemed out of place until it was too late. The prairie had a way of swallowing stories whole, and the Benders knew how to feed it. The Bender family stepped onto the Kansas prairie, as if they had always been there, but their presence unsettled even in the earliest days. Neighbors recalled first meetings with unease, describing a family that seemed stitched together out of contradictions, outwardly ordinary yet curiously opaque, familiar yet unknowable. In a land where everyone's story was visible, how many acres they tilled, how many children they raised, what hymns they sang on Sunday, the Benders were shadows at the edge of the firelight. Pa, whose given name was often recorded as John, appeared older than his years. His frame was tall and broad, yet stooped with a stiffness that suggested labor had bent him permanently. His English was broken, delivered in short, clipped phrases, his accent thick enough that conversations with him often ended in confusion. Some called him surly, others thought him merely inarticulate. But there was something in his eyes, a kind of guarded suspicion that made people keep their distance. He was not a man eager to be known. Elvira, the matriarch, carried her own darkness. Neighbors called her Ma, though rarely with affection. Accounts describe her as coarse, unfriendly, quick to scowl or curse. She kept her hair tied back severely, her expression carved in disapproval, and when she spoke it was with a rasp that turned even ordinary words sharp. Women in the area avoided her, and men, when they greeted her, often did so quickly and without meeting her eyes. Some whispered she had been married before, perhaps more than once, and that her past was littered with secrets. Whether true or not, the rumor clung to her like a second skin. John Jr., lanky and awkward, was the strangest of the four, younger than his parents but already marked by odd mannerisms. He laughed at inappropriate moments, his high-pitched, chuckle-puncturing silences with discomfort. Some said he was simple-minded, others thought him sly. He did little to ease suspicion, often staring too long at passers-by, grinning in ways that felt less like friendliness and more like the stretching of a mask if his parents inspired unease through their severity. John Jr. inspired it through the uncanny sense that he was not quite connected to the world around him. But Kate was different. She was the light the family dangled before the darkness, the mask that drew people close, young and striking, with eyes that seemed to promise both intimacy and mystery. She projected confidence in ways her kin never could, while her parents muttered in thick accents, and her brother fumbled through awkward silences. Kate spoke clearly, persuasively, and with charm. She dressed with a care unusual for the frontier, her clothes neat and her hair styled to flatter her features. To travelers wary from dust and hardship, she seemed almost radiant, an anchor of civility in an unforgiving land. Kate's allure was heightened by the role she claimed for herself, that of a spiritualist and healer. Across America, spiritualism was sweeping through parlors and pulpits alike. Seances, table rapping, and communications with the dead fascinated a nation still grieving its Civil War losses. In Kansas, far from the sophistication of eastern cities, Kate's claims held special power. She offered readings, charms, and remedies. She promised contact with lost loved ones, for lonely settlers and superstitious travelers. She became a source of hope. People came to the Bender cabin, not only for food and shelter, but for glimpses of eternity through Kate's words. Yet her confidence carried edges. She was known to speak boldly about free love, about rejecting the strict codes of purity in marriage that defined the era. To her, love was natural, not confined to vows or contracts. In a deeply religious community, such words bordered on scandal. Men found her ideas provocative. Women considered them dangerous. Still, her beauty and poise often silenced criticism. Kate was both admired and distrusted, both desired and condemned. It was she who gave the family a face the neighbors tolerated, while Pagloward, Ma sneered, and John Jr. giggled. Kate smiled. She was the one who welcomed travelers to the table, who engaged them in conversation, who distracted them while her family moved in the shadows. Without her, the Benders might have been merely strange. With her, they became inviting, and therein lay their deception. Even in the early years, small rumors clung to them. A traveler who passed through the area claimed he had stayed at the Bender cabin and felt uneasy, describing the house as strangely arranged, with a canvas partition that seemed designed to hide more than it revealed. A neighbor recalled hearing arguments from the cabin at night, Kate's sharp voice cutting through the prairie winds. Others said John Jar's laughter drifted into the dark like the sound of something not entirely human. Animals, too, seemed unsettled. Horses tied near the cabin often balked or grew restless. Dogs avoided the property, skirting wide circles around it, as if obeying some instinct their masters lacked. And though the family farmed and kept a garden, their harvests seemed meager compared to others in the area. It was as though the land itself resisted them. Yet nothing concrete emerged. For every whisper, there was an explanation. Perhaps the traveler was tired and fanciful. Perhaps the arguments were ordinary family disputes. Perhaps the animals were sensitive to strangers. Life on the frontier was hard, and eccentricity was not unusual. So the rumors remained whispers, never growing into accusations. It was Kate's spiritual practices that drew the most consistent attention. She held seances for neighbors, speaking in low tones while candles guttered, claiming to channel voices from beyond. Some swore she predicted illnesses before they struck. Others said she cured ailments with herbs and charms. Whether her powers were real or not mattered less than the impression she created for those desperate to believe. She offered proof of mysteries beyond the veil. For those skeptical, she was a fraud but a compelling one. And always, travelers passing through were intrigued by her, staying longer than they might have otherwise, drawn into conversation that held them at the family's table. These seeds of strangeness pious silence. Ma's bitterness. John Jerter's uncanny laugh. Kate's bold spiritualism were planted early. In hindsight, they look like warnings, signs that something darker pulsed beneath the family, Svekheid. But at the time, they blended into the fabric of frontier life, where every family carried secrets and every neighbor was a little odd. It was only when travelers began to vanish, when wagons were found without masters and horses wandered loose, that the whispers began to sharpen into suspicion. For now, though, the Benders lived among their neighbors, tolerated if not embraced, feared if not accused. They hosted wary travelers, offered meals and shelter, and let their daughter's charm cover their strangeness. The seeds had been planted, and soon those seeds would grow into something the prairie would never forget. The prairie is vast, and in its silence, people disappear easily. A man on horseback can vanish into tall grass and be swallowed by the horizon. A wagon can creak into the distance and never be seen again. On the Osage Trail, travelers came and went in such numbers that absence itself seemed unremarkable. But by 1872, the rhythm of vanishings grew too insistent, too concentrated, and always seemed to echo back toward the same lonely homestead. At first, no one noticed. A single prospector never reached his destination. A merchant bound for independence was weeks overdue. A family of settlers abandoned their wagon along the road, its wheels locked in mud, its horses grazing nervously nearby. Accidents, people said. Outlaws. Perhaps. The land was wild, the frontier unforgiving. Yet when wagons piled up without masters, when neighbors whispered of children who vanished into the prairie, suspicion began to drift like smoke across Labette County. It was the small details that unsettled people first. Farmers who passed the Bender property at dusk recalled seeing lantern light flickering in the orchard, long after the work of planting or harvesting should have been finished. A boy tending cattle near the trail swore he heard muffled cries rising from beneath the cabin floor, a sound quickly smothered by laughter. A woman claimed she dreamt of Kate Bender standing over her bed, whispering that death walked close at hand. In any other time, such tales might have been dismissed as superstition. But here, where the prairie stretched without end and silence made imagination fertile, rumors found purchase. Kate herself remained the family's most effective disguise. She continued to offer her spiritual services, drawing both neighbors and strangers into her orbit. She spoke of spirits restless in the soil, of voices lingering just beyond the veil, of remedies for illness and charms against misfortune. For men traveling alone, she was an enchantress. For women grieving or fearful, she was a curious ally. Her beauty, her poise, her promise of something beyond the ordinary, it was enough to hold attention at the table, to keep eyes fixed forward while shadows moved behind the canvas partition. Neighbors began to notice the arrangement of the Bender cabin. The table was always placed in the same position, chairs set just so. Guests sat with their backs to the canvas curtain, their faces toward Kate. Behind the curtain, one of the men might wait, hammer in hand. The design was perfect in its simplicity. No one who entered suspected they were walking into a stage where hospitality and death had been rehearsed a dozen times before. By late 1872, disappearances had multiplied. A man named Launcher, traveling with his daughter, was last seen heading toward the Osage Trail. Neither was heard from again. Another merchant's goods turned up for sale miles away, though no one could say who had carried them. The disappearances began to stack like unmarked stones, each one heavier than the last, Families wrote letters. Friends searched the trail, yet answers were always just beyond reach. Whispers hardened into fear. The prairie community, close-knit yet fragile, began to question itself. Who among them could be trusted? Was the danger truly from outlaws roaming the trail? Or was it closer, wearing the mask of a neighbor? The bender's strangeness no longer seemed harmless eccentricity. It began to feel like camouflage. Pious silence. Hostility. Jar's unsettling laugh, all the things once tolerated now reedy as omens. Kate, however, pressed harder into her role. She announced public lectures on spiritualism, drawing curious settlers to hear her speak of free love, of life beyond death, of liberation from society's chains. Some left unsettled, others enthralled, but all remembered her face, her voice, her confidence. She made herself unforgettable, and in doing so, she ensured that those who vanished after visiting the Bender home had a reason to stop there in the first place. When winter came, snow muffled the land, covering the prairie in silence. Travelers still moved along the Osage Trail, their wagons creaking through frost and wind. Some reached shelter in town, others did not. By spring, the thou revealed wagons half buried, horses wandering without masters. Letters unanswered. Anxiety simmered into dread. The York family would become the fulcrum on which this dread tipped into revelation. William York, a physician with connections and a name that carried weight, set out in March of 1873 to investigate the disappearance of a neighbor and his daughter. He was expected to return quickly. Days passed. Then weeks. His absence could not be shrugged off like the others. He had powerful family, who would not allow silence to explain his disappearance. His brother, Colonel Alexander York, pressed for answers with the determination of a man unwilling to bury hope. Colonel York's inquiries spread across the county. He questioned settlers, inspected homesteads, demanded testimony. And when he arrived at the Bender property, Kate welcomed him with her usual charm. She even offered her services, claiming she could summon the spirits of the missing. Perhaps even his brother. Pa stood silent. Ma glared. John Jr. chuckled nervously, but Kate smiled, steady and serene. To a man less driven, the mask might have held. To York, it was only another reason to dig deeper. Still, the Benders bought themselves time. The search widened, but no proof emerged. Neighbors grew restless, the community tightening under the strain of fear. And then, suddenly, the Bender cabin stood empty. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows, no voices drifting on the wind. They were gone. When neighbors finally entered, the silence inside was complete. Oppressive. The table still stood, chairs carefully arranged, but the house felt abandoned in haste. Then came the discovery of the trapdoor, the pit beneath it, and the orchard where the earth had been disturbed too recently. Too often, shovels bit into soil, and the prairie began to yield its secrets. Bodies emerged, one after another, men, women, children, all bearing the same marks of violence. York was among them. The orchard had been a graveyard all along. The truth struck Kansas like a hammer. What had begun as whispers of disappearances was now undeniable massacre. Families gathered around the graves, some in mourning, some in disbelief. The newspapers seized the story, branding the Benders America as first family of serial killers. But even as the truth surfaced, the killers themselves had slipped into myth. They were gone, carried away by wagon wind, leaving only horror in their wake. The escalation had been steady, almost invisible, one disappearance after another, tolerated as misfortune. Rumors ignored. Strangeness excused. Hospitality accepted without question until it became a weapon. The prairie had swallowed the victims silently. But now it would not be quiet. The names of the Benders spread across the nation, etched into the record of American crime. And yet, their vanishing ensured the story would never resolve, only deepen. The horror had broken the surface. The community could no longer pretend. And America, reading in its papers about the Orchard of Graves, realized that the frontier, as promise, carried within it a shadow darker than anyone wished to admit. They found the first grave at noon, when the light was harshest and the orchard offered the least shade. A shovel rang against a stone, and then bit into soil that was darker than it should have been, damp where the ground around it lay dry. Someone knelt and pressed 2 fingers in, as though the earth had a pulse. It did. It had been beating here for months. When the clod broke and the smell lifted metallic, sweet, unmistakable, the men turned their faces, then turned them back again, because dread is a kind of gravity. The body lay in a shallow bed that had been made in cruel haste. The clothes were torn where hands had searched for breath that could no longer be found. The skull had collapsed at one temple, a neat ruin, as if the bone had known the exact point of surrender. The throat bore a second sentence. Red once, black now. They stared in silence until someone said the name they had come to fear and hope in the same breath. York. By evening, the orchard was a grid of open mouths. The work took on a ritual pattern, as all difficult work does. 2 men broke ground. 2 more lifted earth. Another laid a sheet beside each rectangle, and when the shape below took form, they rolled the dead onto linen with the reverence of a service. Every object was observed. A button flattened to an oval, a scrap of ribbon, a pocket calendar bloated with rain. Every stray nail and bent pin felt like testimony. The prairie wind tried to carry away the smell, but it could not carry away the meaning. Inside the cabin, discovery unraveled in stages. The table was ordinary smooth, blonde, worn by elbows and plates, but the floor beneath it had a hinge, and the hinge had a habit, and the habit had a depth. They lifted the trapdoor and found the pit. Then lamps. Then ropes. Then stains that had not entirely dried. The earth there was tamped flat by knees and heels. The air held a damp chill, even while afternoon burned outside. A man gagged. Another crossed himself. A third whispered a verse he had not recited since his mother's funeral. On the underside of the table, someone's knife had idly carved 3 letters. No one recognized the initials. No one wished to. They followed the choreography backward until it looked like a plan. The chair would have been placed so the guest's back faced the canvas curtain. Kate would sit opposite, muslin sleeves white in lamp glow, offering a cure for rheumatism or a word from a dead wife. Behind the curtain, a figure would wait with a hammer, its head wrapped in cloth, to soften the report, while another kept a hand on the latch of the trap. A question would be asked to hold the gaze steady. A smile would be offered to hold the body still. Then the swing. The sudden light going out like a lamp in a gust. The thud that belonged under the earth, not on top of it. The breath like a pulled thread. The floor that behaved like water. You could walk step by step through the room and hear it. The soft scrape of chair legs. The breath that empties itself. The brief clutter of cutlery settling after a jerked table. You could see the knife kept not in a drawer, but where a hand would fall without searching. You could feel the way the house had learned its lines. Where to creak and where to keep quiet. Where to hold the cold and where to release it. Even the canvas had a role. It clung to the air like a tongue holding a secret. By late afternoon, the orchard looked like a battlefield without uniforms. They marked each grave with a stake and a letter. Men in shirt sleeves moved like mourners and gravy diggers at once, filling one duty as they discovered another. Women came with clothes soaked in camphor, holding the fumes beneath their noses. A minister stood under a pear tree and recited words too small for what lay at his feet. There were boots that still held the shapes of the feet that wore them. There was a child's shoe with a broken lace. A pocket watch that had stopped at a time no one could agree on, as if it had chosen not to testify. The story took the road as quickly as blood takes the vein. By evening, riders had carried the news to the next farms. By night, lamps burned in towns where the names of the missing had been spoken in kitchens and whispered in beds for months. Newspapers would have their headline in the morning. For now, the prairie had its own press, hoofbeats in the dark, a lantern bobbing like a star with a tremor, a door opening and not closing for a long time. Back in the cabin, a man lifted the bed ticking and found a hammer wrapped in a dishcloth. The cloth had been washed and washed again. The hammer had not. Another found a leather valise under the mattress stuffed with small things travelers keep close. A locket with a lock of hair. A roll of narrow letters tied in ribbon. An ivory-handled comb broken at one tooth. The intimacy of theft felt worse than the violence. This was a house that had learned how to end a life, and then go upstairs and sleep beside it. They searched for a ledger and found it. A book with neat lines, prices for flour and salt, entries for meals, dates, brief notes. Some names had been crossed out with a hard hand, others had been left clean and uncollected, as if their owners might return any afternoon to settle accounts. The last page trailed off mid-number. The pencil, when they picked it up, gave a line as dark as the one before it. As if nothing had changed, the men who dug began. Despite themselves, to argue with the ground. They wanted the earth to be finite in its horror, to offer a number that could be spoken and then buried. But each time they paused, a boot heel found a softer patch. A spade met a resistance that was more than stone. The orchard had been chosen well. Roots disguised the ridges of graves. Leaves kept the soil cool and workable. Fruit fell and rotted and explained the smell that was not only fruit. You could call it cunning. You could call it agriculture. As dusk laid its blue hand over the farm, they lit more lamps. The canvas inside the cabin glowed like a contained fire. Outside, the lamps made each hole a small, lit room with only a floor. Someone shouted for water. Someone else for brandy. The minister stopped speaking and simply held a hat in both hands, as if hats were prayers in another language. A boy who had lied about his age to be included in the work leaned against a tree and cried into his sleeve without sound. There were moments when the rage of the living rose, like a wind ready to tear. Roofs off. If the family had walked back into the yard at that hour, no rope would have been needed. Hands would have done. You could feel justice gathering itself like stormlight. But the Benders had taken their bodies with them, and righteous anger needs a target. In the absence of one, it becomes something else. A vow. Before the night was over, that vow had formed itself plainly on more than one mouth. Find them. The next day, they widened the search beyond the lines of the orchard, following the slight collapses in the turf that only a certain kind of eye can see. They found a hand buried by itself, as if the rest of the man had refused to come along. They found a bundle of clothes, packed as if for a journey, that had been interrupted at the door. They found, in the dirt behind the barn, the impression of a hammerhead, where someone had carelessly set it down circle within circle, like a ripple that never reached a shore. They reconstructed the timing as best they could, a winter of disappearances thickening into a spring of certainty. A physician who rode into the prairie and did not return. A family whose lamp burned late one night and never again. The space between the neighbors' last sight of smoke from the chimney and their first day in the orchard became a corridor in the mind. A hallway down which the Benders had walked free, carrying their names like luggage they intended to discard at the next station. And still the house offered details to those willing to kneel and look closely. The chair legs under the table had small nicks on one side, as if chairs had been pushed back quickly and often from that direction. The canvas hem was greased at the height of a man's hand. It had been gripped and pulled aside 100 times. On the wall, smoke had stained a hollow above where a lamp always sat. On the floor, the boards near the trapdoor were subtly lighter from being scrubbed more vigorously than the rest. Cleanliness can be its own confession. When they finally paused, it was not because the orchard had finished speaking, but because the living needed to sleep. They covered the open ground with sheets, anchored the corners with stones, and set a watch as if guarding the dead from thieves, though the worst thief had already been here and had taken everything. Night deepened. Coyotes argued on the far ridge. The lamps in the cabin dimmed, then steadied, then dimmed again as if the house were breathing. Morning would bring the reckoning. Outward riders dispatched, notices nailed to courthouse doors, descriptions committed to broadside and rumor, the governor's signature on a reward. Morning would invite the nation to look, to gasp, to condemn, to promise itself that such a thing could only happen far away. But the first night belonged to Labette County, to the men and women who had dug with their hands when their shovels struck roots, who had spoken names aloud to teach the wind how to carry them, who had stared into the ground long enough to see themselves staring back. What the papers would call the bloody Benders began here, as numbers in a field. One grave, then another. One body, then a second, then a third. Horror is always arithmetic at the start. It becomes language later. Morning came pale and uncertain, the kind of light that reveals more than it comforts. The orchard looked worse under the sun. Not better. The white sheets spread over the graves had soaked through in patches, their shapes a mute catalogue of limbs beneath. Men gathered again with shovels. Women brought more cloths, and children who had been told to stay away crept to the edges of the crowd and stared with round, unblinking eyes. The prairie, which usually hummed with its chorus of insects and birds, seemed suspended in a silence that did not belong to weather but to memory. By then, the word had traveled. Riders from surrounding towns poured in, tying horses to fence posts until the yard resembled a fairground. Some came with curiosity, others with rage. The minister prayed aloud, but his voice trembled. Justice, not forgiveness, was on the people's tongues. As more graves were opened, the story grew unbearable in its repetition. Each body bore the same marks: a crushed skull, a throat slit with cold precision. Each was buried with haste but not care, as if the killers believed the prairie itself would serve as accomplice. And in a way, it had until now. The discovery of Dread. York's body confirmed the worst fears. He was well dressed still, though his clothing was soiled by months in the earth. His features were recognizable, enough that his brother could identify him. Colonel York stood at the edge of the grave, his hands clasped tight behind his back, his jaw locked. When he finally spoke, his voice was steel. There would be no rest until the family was found. Around him, neighbors nodded, and what began as grief hardened into a pact. Inside the cabin, the investigators kept sifting through evidence. They found blood-soaked boards beneath the trapdoor that no amount of scrubbing could erase. They found a sledgehammer and a smaller mallet, both stained despite attempts to clean them. They found scraps of clothing stuffed into corners, handkerchiefs embroidered with initials, trinkets that belonged to no member of the Bender family. The accumulation of objects turned the cabin into a museum of theft and murder. Each item was an accusation, each scrap a voice. As the days passed, the tally of victims rose. Some reports said 10, others as many as 20. The exact number mattered less than the impression. The Benders had killed again and again, refining their method, confident in their secrecy. That such horrors could take place within reach of neighbors was the most chilling revelation of all. People remembered visits to the Bender homestead, cups of coffee shared, loaves of bread purchased, small conversations exchanged, and wondered how close they had stood to the edge of the pit without knowing it. Trust itself felt poisoned. The newspapers soon descended, and with them came language that turned fact into legend. Headlines screamed of the Kansas butchers, the Hell family, the House of Death. Writers lingered on Kate's beauty, painting her as a temptress who lured men to their doom, while Ma was cast as a hag, Pi as a brute, John Jr. as a half-mad accomplice. The truth blurred as stories spread, but the effect was the same. The Benders became monsters, their farm a synonym for treachery. Every frontier family with an inn or roadside cabin fell under suspicion. Every traveler eyed with doubt. The prairie had revealed a new kind of terror, not wolves or storms, but neighbors. The manhunt began almost at once. Posses rode in all directions, scouring trails, rivers, and towns. Rewards were posted. Descriptions circulated. Pa, tall, stooped, heavy accent. Ma, severe, scowling, broad-shouldered. John Jr., thin, awkward, with a laugh that grated like a hinge. Kate, striking, confident, with dark hair and a calm gaze. It seemed impossible that a family so notorious could simply vanish. And yet, they had. Every lead turned cold, every rumor ended in smoke. The frontier, so good at hiding graves, proved equally good at hiding the living. For those who remained in Labette County, life was transformed. The orchard was left to rot. No one wanted its fruit. The cabin was stripped by souvenir hunters. Each board carried away, as if possession of a fragment might tether the legend. Children grew up hearing the story, pointing to the spot where the trapdoor had been, daring one another to walk the rows of the orchard at night. Fear hardened into folklore. The bloody Benders ceased to be just a family. They became a warning told in whispers by firelight. And yet, the horror of those days was not only in what was uncovered, but in what remained unresolved. The graves gave up the bodies, but not the answers. Who struck the first blow? Who dug each hole? Who decided when a traveler would not be allowed to leave? Was Kate the mastermind or merely a mask? Did Ma's bitterness drive the cruelty, or Pay's silence, or John Jer's strange detachment? The evidence suggested a family united in violence, each playing a role, but the details were lost the moment they rode away. The orchard spoke of death, but not of motive. The impact spread beyond Kansas. Across the nation, people read of the murders with a shudder, imagining the road they themselves had traveled, the inns they had trusted, the meals they had eaten in strange kitchens. The frontier, once painted as a place of freedom and opportunity, now bore a darker stain. Civilization had reached Kansas, yes, but so had its shadows. The promise of safety, of hospitality, had been betrayed. The Benders had taken one of the oldest human gestures, offering food and shelter, and turned it into a trapdoor. That betrayal lingered longer than any grave. When the excavation finally ended, the orchard looked like a field after battle, earth torn open, rows of mounds hastily covered again. A fence was built to keep animals out, but no barrier could keep memory from roaming. Some said the ground never grew right again, that the trees withered, that the soil was cursed. Others insisted the land healed quickly, eager to forget. But the people who had dug there carried the site with them forever. The bodies rolled onto sheets, the faces of neighbors pale with shock, the silence broken only by the dull thud of a spade meeting its mark. The climax of horror was not a single discovery, but the accumulation of them, body after body, grave after grave, each one confirming that the nightmare was larger than anyone had dared imagine. It was not one murder, or two, but a pattern woven into the daily life of the county. Hidden in plain sight, the Benders had turned routine into ritual, and the prairie had covered for them, and it could no longer bear the weight of its secrets. When the last grave was filled again, when the last body had been identified or mourned, the community gathered in the shadow of the orchard. There were prayers, though they sounded thin against the enormity of what had happened. There were vows of vengeance, though the killers were already gone. There were tears, though the prairie wind carried them away as quickly as it dried them. And then there was silence, heavy and enduring, the kind of silence that does not fade but settles into the bones of a place. The climax was not only the revelation of bodies, but the realization of betrayal, that a family could smile, serve bread, and speak of spirits while preparing the pit beneath your feet, that neighbors could pass their gate and wave, never knowing the orchard was not a farm but a graveyard, that evil did not always arrive from the wilderness. It could live under a roof, behind a smile, at a table. The trapdoor was closed again. The orchard receded, but the story refused to bury itself. It would travel, growing in the telling, until the name Bender no longer belonged to a family, but to a legend carved into the dark grain of American history. The graves were closed again, but closing the ground did not close the wound. For weeks, the orchard drew visitors who came not to mourn but to stare. They leaned on their saddles or stood with hats in hand, gazing at the rows of soil as if the earth itself might confess something more. Strangers from neighboring counties rode in simply to see the place where the Benders had lived, to stand in the cabin's doorway and feel the draft rising from the trapdoor, to walk the orchard paths and count how many stakes marked how many lives. The house was stripped in pieces by curiosity. One man carried off the table, another the canvas partition, still another pried boards from the walls. Sylvaner hunters took everything they could, until the cabin stood bare and skeletal, an empty shell that looked less like a home than the husk of a crime scene. The manhunt stretched out in all directions. Pass after pass scarred the trails, following wagon ruts that quickly faded into grass. The descriptions spread faster than the search. Pass stooped and grim, Ma scowling. John Jr., with his strange laugh. Kate dark-haired and beautiful. Speaking of spirits, broadside posters carried their likenesses, crude sketches that made them look both more monstrous and more ordinary. Depending on who looked, rewards were posted, but none collected. The Benders had vanished as effectively as if the prairie itself had decided to protect them. Rumors sprouted with the persistence of weeds. Some said they had fled north to Iowa and taken on new names. Others believed they had crossed into Indian territory, hiding among those already displaced and hunted. Still others swore that vigilantes caught them within days, that Pay and John Jr. were hanged from a tree while Ma and Kate were shot and buried in shallow graves of their own. These stories carried conviction but no evidence. The bodies of the victims were unearthed and laid to rest, but the bodies of the killers remained imagined, unseen, their absence louder than any presence could have been. For the York family, grief hardened into relentless pursuit. Colonel Alexander York devoted his influence and resources to tracking leads, but each one dissolved. Witnesses contradicted each other. Sightings grew fantastical. At one point, 2 women arrested in Michigan were accused of being Ma and Kate, held in jail for weeks as neighbors argued over their identities. The case fell apart when testimony wavered and memory blurred. They were released, leaving the question more unsettled than before. Years later, 2 men in Texas were said to be Pay and John Jr., but again the evidence crumbled. The hunt never ended cleanly. The Benders lived on in every whisper of fugitives sighted, in every stranger whose accent matched, in every woman with a dark gaze who seemed too confident for the world around her. The newspapers, meanwhile, transformed the Benders into myth. They printed illustrations of the cabin with exaggerated shadows, of Kate with eyes like daggers, of Ma bent and crooked like a witch. Some accounts multiplied the victims far beyond the number of graves. Others turned the orchard into a stage of ritual sacrifice. In retellings, the family became more than human, they were demons. Succubi, incarnations of evil itself. Yet this exaggeration served a purpose. By making them monstrous, it allowed readers to believe they were not ordinary. For what unsettled most was the realization that the Benders had been entirely human, entirely neighborly, and entirely capable of atrocity. In Labette County, life moved forward, but not cleanly. Neighbors who had once exchanged labor or meals with the Benders now replayed every detail of those encounters. A loaf of bread bought, a word exchanged, a glance that lingered too long, all reinterpreted through the lens of murder. People doubted themselves, ashamed they had not seen what now seemed obvious. Some families abandoned their farms, unwilling to live in the shadow of the orchard. Others stayed but never forgot. Children grew up daring each other to run across the land at night, as though proximity to the site might prove courage. The name Bender lingered in hushed tones, a synonym for betrayal. The legacy of the case spread into the national psyche. In parlors back east, the story was told as a cautionary tale. The frontier was not merely a land of promise, but a place where civility could collapse into horror. Ministers preached sermons about the dangers of godlessness, pointing to the Benders as proof of what happens when faith is abandoned. Lawmen cited the case as evidence of the need for stronger sheriffs, better courts, and more centralized authority. Politicians spoke of it when arguing for railroads and telegraphs, because in the Benders' isolation, murder had thrived unchecked. The prairie, once celebrated as America's open future, had revealed itself as a place where the thin fabric of society could be ripped open with a single hammer blow. Kate remained the most enduring figure in the legend. Newspapers lingered on her face, her speeches, her supposed charm. She was cast alternately as seductress, witch, mastermind, or pawn. Men wrote about her with fascination, women with fury. Some said she alone orchestrated the killings, her beauty the bait that made victims careless. Others insisted she was merely another instrument of her parents' cruelty. Either way, she became a symbol, the smiling mask of death, the embodiment of hospitality betrayed. The land itself bore the weight of the story. Travelers avoided the road near the orchard, taking detours rather than pass the site. Some claimed to hear strange noises at night, cries from beneath the soil, the sound of a hammer striking wood, the laughter of John Jr., carried on the wind. Lanterns were said to flicker in the orchard, even when no one was there. The ground was called cursed, though curse was just another word for memory that will not fade, even after the cabin collapsed and the orchard grew wild. The story clung to the soil. The prairie, once silent about what it had hidden, now spoke of nothing else. Historians and storytellers would return again and again to the Benders. Each generation reinvented the tale, polishing or distorting details, but always returning to the same truths. The trapdoor, the orchard, the vanished family. Some emphasized the horror of the murders, others the mystery of the escape. Some framed it as a parable about trust, others about the dangers of isolation. The legend survived because it was never complete, never concluded. Without bodies or trials, the Benders remained unfinished, and unfinished stories echo longest. Even today, their fate is debated. Were they hunted down and silenced? Their deaths unrecorded? Did they live quietly under new names, carrying their secret across decades? Or did they dissolve into folklore so thoroughly that even if evidence emerged, no one would believe it? The truth hides in the gap between history and memory, between what the prairie swallowed and what it chose to spit back. The aftermath of the Bender murders was not just a search for 4 fugitives. It was a confrontation with the unsettling truth that evil can live inside the home, that hospitality can mask slaughter, that the neighbor you greet at dawn may carry a hammer meant for your skull. Their legacy is not the orchard or the trapdoor alone, but the distrust they planted in the American imagination. The frontier was never again only promise. It was also risk, and in that risk lived the echo of the Benders. So the orchard grew wild, the cabin rotted, the graves sank back into the earth, yet the story refused to die. It travels still, in newspaper archives, in folklore collections, in the shudder of anyone who hears the name. The bloody benders were never caught, never judged, never buried. They linger instead in the uneasy knowledge that absence can be more haunting than presence. Theirs is the silence that endures, the legend that unsettles, the nightmare that has no end. And so I ask you now, what do you think became of them? Did justice catch them in secret? Unrecorded? Did they live out long lives under masks of ordinary labor? Or are they still wandering in memory? Proof that some crimes never close. Leave your thoughts below. I want to know your theory. And if this tale has unsettled you, if you want more stories from the darker corners of history, subscribe to Chronicles of Dread, because these shadows are not alone. The past is full of them, waiting in silence, until someone dares to dig.